On a Thursday, my wife and I moved 41 years of pension and Social Security into an account nobody knew about. We left $96 behind in the old one. At 6 the next morning, my son came through our front door. He grabbed me by the collar in our own hallway and screamed that we had ruined his life. Behind him, his wife was pulling open every drawer in my kitchen looking for the money that had disappeared. And the two of us just stood there. We didn't say a word because there was a camera above their heads. It had been recording for 3 days. They thought they were looking at two panicked old people. What they didn't know is that every word out of their mouths had already been recorded days before either of them walked in. 3 hours later, both of them were in handcuffs. But if you think I'm the one who planned all this, you're wrong. I didn't see any of it coming. My wife saw all of it. And I spent 3 weeks telling her she was reading too much into things. My name is Marlon Kubak. Everybody's called me Cub since about 1978. I'm 69 years old, and I've lived in Reno, Nevada since I was 4. I spent 34 years as a slot technician. Now people hear that and picture a man with a screwdriver opening a machine when somebody's ticket printer jams. And that's about 10% of it. I did that too. But the back half of my career, I was inside those cabinets, boards, hoppers, bill validators, and later on the whole network side of it when everything went to servers. I know how those machines work at the level of the schematic. And here's the thing I know that almost nobody outside the business knows. And it is the entire spine of this story, so hold on to it. A slot machine has never taken $1 from anybody in the history of the world. Not one. It cannot. There's no arm that comes out. Every dollar that goes into a machine is handed over voluntarily by a person one pull at a time. And the single most important piece of engineering in that whole cabinet is not the payout percentage. It's the near miss. 2 cherries and a blank on the third reel. A jackpot symbol landing just above the pay line where you can see it sitting there. That is designed. That is on purpose. It's not a loss the machine got sloppy about, it's a loss built to look like an almost. Because a loss that looks like a loss makes a person stand up. And a loss that looks like an almost keeps the hand moving. 34 years I stood on that carpet. And I want you to hold that, because in about 10 minutes I'm going to tell you that my own family ran on that exact mechanism for 2 years and I did not see it. And I am the one man in Woe County who should have. My wife is Willeen. Everybody calls her Willa. 45 years this September. We met in 1979 at a laundromat on Wells Avenue, which is not romantic and which she tells people anyway. She spent 31 years in medical records, clinical coding mostly, which, if you don't know it, means she spent 3 decades reading a doctor's chart against a billing sheet and finding the place where they didn't match. That is her actual professional skill. Finding the line that doesn't reconcile. I have teased that woman about her filing for 4 decades. She keeps everything. 3 ring binders in the hall closet going back to 1986, tabbed in order. Who's ever going to read all that? I'd say, turns out, one person was, and it was her. And it saved us about $118,000. Our son is Bracken. Everybody calls him Brack. He's 41. And I need to tell you about Brack at 9 years old, because everything in this comes out of that. When I worked swinging shift, Willow would drop him at the property about 10 minutes before I got off. And he'd sit in the coffee shop off the casino floor with a Shirley Temple and do his homework, and then we'd walk out together. And that boy loved it. He loved the noise, and the carpet, and the men in the shop with their bins of boards. He'd ask me what every part did, and he wanted to do it. From about 11 to about 22, that's what my son wanted to be. And then the industry changed around 2004 through 2010. Everything went to server-based and central determination. And the shop I worked in went from 19 technicians to 6. They weren't hiring. They were not going to hire again. He never got in. It wasn't anybody's fault. It just closed. He sells commercial insurance now, out of an office on Kitsky. He's been doing it 14 years, and he has never once, not one single time, said anything good about it. Hold on to that, too. 7 years ago, he married a woman named Shaughnessy. Everybody calls her Shawn. She's 37. She does aesthetics, injectables, laser, that whole business. And she owns a piece of a clinic out in South Reno. And Willa knew inside a year. Not about the money, about the shape of it. She said to me after the third or fourth time they came over, "Cube, watch how she looks at the house." And I said, "What house? It's a 1960 ranch on Arston with a swamp cooler." And Willa said, "Watch." Anyway, so I watched, and what I saw was a woman doing an appraisal. Her eyes went across the front room the way an adjuster's eyes go across a car. And I said she was probably just nervous. And my wife looked at me with the exact patience she has used on me since 1979 and said, "Okay." She does that. When she's certain and I'm not, she says, "Okay." And she waits. And she has been right roughly 90% of the time for 45 years. And I have learned nothing from it. Brack changed slow. The Sunday calls stopped in about year 3. Then the drop-ins. Then he'd come by and Sean would do most of the talking and he'd sit there and agree with things. I said he was busy. Willis said he's careful. That's different from busy. 2 years ago in February, he came over by himself, sat at that kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, and he said, "Dad, I want to help you and Mom with the bills." I put the paper down. He said it was getting complicated. Online banking, auto pay, the credit union app. He said it wasn't my generation's thing, and he didn't mean it in a bad way, and I didn't take it in a bad way. And he smiled at me. And here's the thing I have to say, because if I don't say it, none of the rest makes sense. That was the real smile. That was my son's actual face, not a performance. I have gone back over that afternoon about 400 times looking for the tell, and there isn't one. And I have decided that's because there wasn't anything to find yet. In February, he meant it. The rot came later. It always comes later. That's the part nobody understands about people who do this. Most of them are not planning it in February. So I said, "All right. We'll put you on the checking account for the bills." Willow was standing in the doorway with a dish towel in her hands, and she did not say one word. And when he left, she said, "That was a mistake." And I said, "He's trying to help." And she said, "Is he? Or is he being careful?" It took her 2 weeks. She came to me on a Sunday morning with the statement, and she was careful about it, too careful, which is how I knew before she said anything. She spread it out on the table and she put her finger on 4 lines and she said, "These don't match any bill we have." And I looked and she was right. Nothing enormous, $240, $310, $185, amounts that are close enough to a real bill that you'd skate right past them. I said, "Maybe there's an explanation." And Willis said, "Maybe. Let's find out how bad it could be before we ask him." That's the whole woman right there in one sentence. Not let's confront him. Not let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Let's find out how bad it could be. She went down to the credit union on Monday and pulled 6 months. She came home at 11 and sat at that table for 4 hours with 3 highlighters. And she built a system. Yellow for questionable, orange for definitely not ours, and a green check for anything she could tie to an actual invoice. There was very little green. 6 months, $19,200. I want to tell you what I did when she showed me that number because it's not flattering. I argued. I stood in my own kitchen and I told my wife there were probably transfers she didn't know about and that some of it might be him paying a bill early and that we should ask him before we jumped to anything. And I said one thing I'd give a lot to take back. I said, Willa, you've never liked her, and I need you to be honest with yourself about whether that's in this. 45 years, and that is the worst sentence I have ever said to that woman. She did not raise her voice. She has never once raised her voice at me, and it is the most unnerving quality a person can have. She said, "You're right that I don't like her, and that's why I pulled 6 months instead of coming to you after one line." And she let me finish all of it, 2 or 3 minutes. And then she said, "Cube, he's had access for 2 weeks. This is 6 months of statements." And I sat down, because she was right, and it took me about 4 seconds to catch up. And I want you to understand the size of it. He got on that account in February. The withdrawals started in the previous September, which meant that when my son sat at my kitchen table and offered to help me with my bills, he was not starting something. He was regularizing something he'd already been doing for 5 months. He had been getting in some other way, and we found out later it was the online login which he'd set up for us in 2019 as a favor, and which he had never taken himself off of, and which nobody had thought about since. That's when I stopped arguing with my wife, and I have not started again. Willa called Booker Lamb the next morning. Booker's 70. He does estate and elder work out of an office on Court Street, and he did our wills in 2011 and Willa's mother's before that. We sat in front of his desk and Willa put the binder on it, because by then it was a binder, tabbed with a table of contents in her handwriting. Booker read for 11 minutes without saying anything. Then he looked up over his glasses and said, "Mrs. Kubak, how long did this take you?" And she said, "A weekend." And he said, "I've had forensic accountants give me less." Then he asked how far back we'd pulled. Willis said 6 months, and Booker said pull 3 years. And I said, "Booker, he's only had access since February." And he took his glasses off and said, "Mr. Kubiak, the access is not the crime. The access is the part he asked permission for." Willow went back down there on a Wednesday and asked Nadira Sheth, who's been the branch manager there since 2015 and who knows us. And Nadira looked at her and said, very quietly, "Mrs. Kubak, is somebody taking advantage of you?" And Willis said, "I don't know yet. Ask me in a week." That week was the longest of my life, and my wife and I barely talked about it because what was there to say? The records came on a Thursday. I was out in the garage and I heard the front door, and then I heard her footsteps stop in the hall. Just stop halfway down the hall. And I stood up off that stool and I knew she was at the table when I came in. Papers everywhere. And she was not crying. Willa does not cry easy, and she wasn't crying then. But her face had gone a color I'd only seen twice, and one of them was at her mother's funeral. I said, "How much?" And she said, $118,400. I sat down. Had to. Over how long? 26 months. It starts at $300 a month. By last summer, it's $4,000 and $5,000 at a shot. And Cube, she turned a page, it's always within 2 days of a deposit. Now, I want to slow all the way down here because this is the exact second the whole thing turned over for me. And it had nothing to do with the number. Within 2 days of a deposit, our pension hits on the 3rd. Social Security hits on the 2nd Wednesday, which means for 26 months my son knew our deposit schedule better than I did. And he was waiting. He wasn't taking what he needed when he needed it. He was taking when the well filled. That is not somebody in a jam. That is somebody with a system. And then Willa said, "There's one more thing." And she pulled out a single sheet, a credit line application, $24,000 in my name. And at the bottom of it, my signature. I picked it up and I looked at it a long time. And it was close. It was really close. The M was right, and the loop on the K was right. But my last letter runs downhill. It has since I was a kid. Every K I have ever written drops off the line at the end because I'm already moving on to the next thing. That one sat level. I said, "That's not mine." And Willa said, "I know. I already knew." And I said, "How?" And she said, "Because it's too neat. Yours is never that neat." 31 years of reading charts. She caught it in about 6 seconds. And she'd been sitting with it for an hour waiting for me to get to it myself. And that's the moment it stopped being a family problem. Because everything before that, every withdrawal, every dollar, a lawyer can stand up in a courtroom and call it a misunderstanding about the scope of permission. You cannot misunderstand your way into writing another man's name. If you have ever had somebody hand you proof about a person you love and felt yourself reaching for a reason it might not mean what it means, that's not stupidity. And it isn't denial exactly, it's that your whole nervous system is voting. Mine voted for 3 weeks. Willis didn't vote at all, and I think that's because she'd already grieved it quietly somewhere around week 2 while I was still explaining things. Booker laid it out on a Tuesday. He said elder financial exploitation, forgery, and depending on what else turned up, identity theft. He said Nevada takes the elder piece seriously, and that we were past the point where this ends with a family conversation. And then he said the thing that mattered. He said, "You cannot confront him." I said, "He's my son. I have to." And Booker said, "The second he knows, 2 things happen. He starts explaining, which he'll be good at because he's had 26 months to practice. And every piece of paper that's still in his house goes in a bag." He said, "Here's what you do instead. You cut it off without a word, and then you let him show you who he is." And Willis said, "How?" And Booker Lamb said, "He'll come to the house." Here's what we did. We opened a new account at a different institution entirely. Willa did it because Willa does the paperwork. Pension and Social Security redirected effective the next cycle. We left the old account open with $96 in it. I asked Booker, "Why not 0?" And he said, "Because 0 looks like a decision and 96 looks like an oversight, and we wanted the reaction to happen at our house and not in his lawyer's office." And on the Tuesday, I put a camera up over the front door. It's a doorbell unit, $90 at the hardware store on Mayan. Took me 20 minutes on a stepladder. Willa stood in the doorway watching me do it with her arms folded. She said, "You think they'll come here?" And I said, "When the money doesn't land, yeah, they'll come here." And she said, "Good." That's my wife. 68 years old, 5'2", 31 years reading other people's charts. Good. Then we waited 11 days. And I want to tell you about those 11 days because I don't think anybody talks about this part. He called twice. Normal calls. "How you doing, Dad? Is Mom's knee any better? What do you think of the game?" And I sat in my kitchen and I talked to my son about basketball while the $96 sat in that account like a baited hook. And I was pleasant and I was warm. And when I hung up the second time, I went out in the garage and sat on that stool for about half an hour. Because I loved him. That is the thing that doesn't fit anywhere in a story like this, and I'm going to say it anyway. In the middle of all of it, on the phone, I loved that man. And there was one night in there, the Sunday, I think, where I got up at about 2 in the morning and went out to the kitchen and got the phone off the charger and stood there with it in my hand for probably 4 minutes because everything in me wanted to call him and say, I know all of it, just come here and tell me the truth and we'll figure it out. I want that on the record, because I think a lot of people watching this are standing in a kitchen at 2 in the morning right now with a phone in their hand. And what stopped me was not strength. What stopped me was that I turned around and Willa was standing in the doorway in her robe. She hadn't said anything. She'd just been standing there, and she said, "Put it down, Cube." And I put it down. That's the whole marriage right there. She didn't argue with me. She didn't remind me of anything. She just came and stood where she could see me. The deposit hit the new account on a Thursday morning. Willa checked her phone at the breakfast table and looked up at me and said, "It's in." And I said, "Then it starts now." Friday morning, 6:10. It wasn't a knock. I want to be precise about that because it ended up mattering. The door itself shook. 3 hits hard with the flat of a hand, and then a fourth. Willow was already up and dressed. Both of us had been sleeping about 4 hours a night for a week and a half. I looked at my phone. The camera feed was up. Brack was on the porch, and behind him, halfway down the walk, was Sean. I opened the door. Now, I want to slow this all the way down because it lasted 11 minutes and 40 seconds. I know that because that's the length of the file, and it is the longest scene in this whole thing. He came in before I could say anything. Right past me into the front room, and he said, "Where is it?" I said, "Where's what?" And he said, Don't do that. The account's got nothing in it. Where's the money?" And Sean came in behind him and did not stop in the front room. She went straight through to the kitchen. I heard her open a drawer, then another one. She was going through my kitchen drawers in my house at 6 in the morning, looking for a statement or a card or whatever she thought was in there. And I want to tell you what that sounded like because it is the detail I have not been able to get rid of. That's Willa's kitchen. Those are the drawers my wife has had organized in the same arrangement since we redid that kitchen in 1997. The junk drawer sticks, and you have to lift it. And I heard it stick, and I heard her force it. And there was a moment, maybe 2 seconds, where the only sound in that whole house was a woman I had eaten Thanksgiving dinner with 7 times going through my wife's drawers. And Willa came around the corner from the hall, and she was completely calm, and she said, "Good morning, Brack." That's all. Good morning. And I want you to understand what that did. He came in there at full volume and expecting a fight, and my wife met him with a pleasant good morning, and it took the ground out from under him for about 2 seconds. Then he got it back. He said, "Mom, don't be like that. The mortgage came out and it bounced. The car came out and it bounced. Do you understand what that does to us?" And Sean came out of the kitchen and said, "You have destroyed our credit. Do you have any idea what you've done?" And I said, and I kept my voice level because I've been telling myself for 11 days to keep my voice level. I said, "What we've done?" And Sean said, "Yes, what you've done." And Willa said, "Brock, that's our pension." And here's the part that I still cannot get around, and it's the reason I'm telling this to strangers on the internet. My son said, "We built our life around that. Around our pension." He said it out loud in our front room, and he did not hear himself say it. There was no flinch. It came out of him the way a fact comes out. The house in Somerset, $3,850 a month, 2 cars, the clinic buy-in, all of it. And he had built it on money that comes out of a state retirement system for 34 years of a man opening cabinets. Willis said, "You were supposed to pay our bills, Brack. You were not supposed to live on us." And Sean said, "You gave him access. That makes it ours." And Willis said, "No. That's the line. That's the one I'd put on a shirt. That makes it reachable. It doesn't make it yours." Sean's mouth actually opened, and nothing came out. And that's when Brack put his hands on me. He came across that room and got both hands on my shoulders and put me back into the wall by the coat hooks. Not hard enough to hurt. And I want to be accurate about that. It wasn't a blow, it was a shove and a hold. And he had his face maybe 8 inches from mine. And he said, "You're going to call them right now and put it back." Now I am 69. He's 41 and he's got 40 pounds on me. And I had about 1.5 seconds to make a decision. And I want to walk you through it because it's the only genuinely difficult thing I did in this entire business. I could have shoved back. I wanted to. Every part of a man wants to. And if I had, then what's on that camera is 2 men fighting in a hallway. And every lawyer in Washoe County calls that a family dispute. And a family dispute goes nowhere. So I didn't move. I let my son hold his father against a wall in his father's own house, and I did not lift a hand. And I want to tell you honestly that it is the most humiliating 30 seconds I have ever experienced. And I would do it again tomorrow. And I'll tell you what I was actually looking at while it happened, because it wasn't him. There's a row of coat hooks on that wall. 4 of them. I put them up in 1994. And the second one from the left has a mark under it about the size of a thumbprint where a 9-year-old boy hung a backpack every single day for 6 years and the wall never recovered. I was 8 inches from my son's face, and I was looking past his ear at that mark. If you have ever had to hold absolutely still while somebody you love did something that could not be taken back, because moving would have made it worse, or because moving would have handed them the version of the story they wanted, then you know what that is. It is not restraint. There's no dignity in it while it's happening. You just stand there and go somewhere else in your head. And mine went to a backpack. And Willa said, from about 6 feet away, in a voice like a nurse taking a temperature, "Brack, take your hands off your father." And Sean said, "Don't talk to him." And Willis said, "The camera above the door has been running since Tuesday." 11 seconds. I counted them later on the file. 11 seconds, where nobody in that room said one word. I watched my son's face, and it went through about 4 things. First, he didn't believe her. Then he looked at the door, actually turned his head and looked at the transom over the door. Then he saw it. And then his hands came off my shoulders like I'd gone hot, and he backed up 2 steps. And Sean said, "You're recording us? That's illegal." And Willis said, "It's a doorbell camera on our own house." And then my son said the only thing he said that whole morning that I believe was true. He said, "Dad, I was going to put it back." And there it is. I've heard that sentence about 900 times in my life, standing on a carpet, from people who had just fed a machine everything in their pocket. I was going to get it back. They left. Sean was still talking on the way down the walk, and Willa and I stood in our front room, and neither of us moved for a while. And then she came over and put her hand flat on my chest, right where he'd had me, and neither of us said anything. Detective Alna Yepes came out that afternoon. She watched the file twice. Then she watched the first 90 seconds again, and she said, "Mr. Kubak, why didn't you push him off you?" And I said, "Because I've been married 45 years to a woman who told me not to." And Detective Yepes looked at Willow and said, "That was correct." They arrested them both the next morning at the house in Somerset. I did not go, and I did not ask. And then the thing got bigger, which I had not expected. Yepes called us in about 3 weeks later, and she had a whiteboard behind her with a timeline on it. $19,700 in credit card debt in my name, 3 cards. $38,500 in personal loans. And here's how they got them. On 3 separate applications, Brack listed our house as an asset worth $800,000, listed himself as sole heir. And this is the one that Willa had to leave the room for. Indicated that both of us were in declining health. He told lenders his parents were rich and dying. We are neither. That house is worth about $340,000, and I ran 4 miles a week until my hip went. And then Yepes put up the last one. $31,000 in casino losses across 14 months. And I said, "Whose?" And she said, "Hers, mostly. Some his." I sat in that room and looked at a printout of ticket in, ticket out records from 3 properties in this town, 2 of which I have personally worked in. And I want to tell you exactly what happened in my chest, because it was not what I expected. It wasn't rage. It was recognition. I have watched that pattern from 6 feet away for 34 years. I could have drawn that curve on a napkin before anybody showed me a printout. It starts small and it's fun. Then there's a hole. Then you're not playing anymore. You're chasing. And chasing is a completely different activity that uses the same machine. And the whole time, the thing that keeps a person in that seat is not winning. Winning gets you up eventually. It's the almost. And here's the part that took me 4 months to be able to say out loud, and Willa had to sit with me on the back steps the night I finally got there. My son ran the same play on us. 26 months. Small at first, then bigger, then systematic, then desperate. And in the middle of it, this is in the records, Willow found it, he paid us back twice. $900 in December of the first year, 600-something the following March, unprompted, into the account. Nobody asked him for it. At the time, I didn't even notice. Willa found those 2 deposits on the 3rd pass, and she brought them to me and said, "Cube, why would he put money back?" And I looked at those 2 lines and it went through me like a current, because I knew exactly why. Because I have known why since 1991. A machine that never pays out doesn't hook anybody. People stand up and walk away. What holds a person is intermittent reward. Small, unpredictable, occasional, partial payoff. Those 2 deposits were the most expensive money we ever received. Because in the moment we got them, without either of us thinking about it, we stopped being parents watching a situation and became players who'd seen the machine pay. $900 in December bought him 11 more months. That's not me being poetic. That is the actual mechanism. And it is the same one printed on a board inside a cabinet. And I spent my whole life inside those cabinets, and it ran in my own kitchen for 2 years. The plea took 4 months. Their attorney was a man named Reese Toiver, who's good, and who opened by trying to make it about a dysfunctional family and greedy parents, and who dropped that line entirely the day after the deputy DA sent him the video. The deputy DA is a woman named Camille Boateng. She's about 38, and she does nothing but financial crimes against older adults. And she was the 3rd person in this whole business to look at Willa's binder and ask who put it together. She was straight with us. She said, trials are unpredictable. Juries can go soft on a family case, and a conviction you negotiate is worth more than a conviction you gamble on. And she asked us what we actually wanted. And Willis said, every dollar back in writing on a schedule. Booker helped us draft what we'd accept, and I want to be clear about what was in it and what wasn't, because I have opinions about how these get portrayed. We did not get a public apology. That's not a thing. You cannot make a plea deal require somebody to be sorry. What we got was pled to felony exploitation of an older person and forgery, with the identity theft counts running concurrent. Full restitution, $118,400 plus the credit card and loan amounts, total just under $177,000, at $1,974 a month for 6 years. 6 years of probation, mandatory gambling treatment for both of them, and a no-contact order. And one thing Camille Boateng told us was worth more than anything else in the document: a full allocution in open court, which means he had to stand up and say what he did out loud, on the record, in front of a judge. Not an apology, a statement of facts. That hearing was in September. Now, I want to slow down again because this was 25 minutes, and it's the last time I was in a room with my son. Judge Nakagawa's courtroom, 2nd floor, a Tuesday morning. There were maybe 11 people in there. Willa wore her navy suit. She has worn that suit to 2 weddings and 4 funerals and 1 hearing. And when Brack came in, I did not recognize him for about a second and a half. He'd lost weight, real weight, 25 pounds of it. His suit was hanging on him, and he had gray at the temples that had not been there in the spring. Sean came in behind him, and she looked exactly the same. And she looked at us the way you look at a road closure. And the judge asked him to state in his own words what he had done. And he stood up, and he had a piece of paper, and his hands were going so bad he had to put it flat on the table to read it. And he said, "I'm giving you the substance. that beginning in September of the year before last, he used online access to his parents' account, which he'd set up for them as a favor and never removed himself from, to withdraw money without permission. He said the total was $118,400 over 26 months. He said he timed the withdrawals to their deposits. He said he applied for a credit line of $24,000 using his father's name and a signature he wrote himself. He said he obtained loans by telling lenders his parents were wealthy and in poor health, both of which he knew were false. He said when they cut off his access, he went to their home and put his hands on his father, and then he stopped reading. And the judge said, "Is there anything further?" And he looked up and he looked at us for the first time, and he said, "I told myself every single month that it was the last one." And Judge Nakagawa said, and this is the part I wrote down in the car afterward, she said, "Mr. Kubak, everyone I sentence in this seat tells me that. It's the most common sentence in this building, and it's the reason the number gets to 118,000 instead of stopping at 300. Then she gave him the terms, and it was done. Out in the hallway, he tried to come toward us, and his attorney caught his arm because of the order, and he stood there about 10 feet away with his hands at his sides. And Willa, my wife, who caught it in 2 weeks, who built the binder, who told me not to push him off me, who did not cry through any of it, said, "Brack, we love you." And then she said, "And we're not going to see you for a while." And she took my arm and we walked to the elevator. I did not say one word to my son in that hallway. I have thought about that more than anything else in this whole business. She got a sentence out, and I got nothing out. And I don't know to this day whether that was strength or whether the tank was just empty. Here's where it all landed. Sean filed for divorce in November, moved to Sacramento to her sister's. That did not surprise anybody. Willa called it in March, in our kitchen before charges were even filed. She said that woman will be gone inside a year of the money stopping. She was off by 2 months. Brack works 2 jobs, warehouse out by the airport during the week and weekend shifts at a rental car facility. He lives in a studio in Sparks. The payment comes on the 1st, $1,974. It has not been late one time in 14 months. And I want to say something about that because I go back and forth on it. That is a man working 6 days a week to pay back his parents for 6 years. And there is a version of me that is proud of him for it. And I do not entirely trust that version. Willis said something about it in April that I thought about a lot. I said something like, "Well, at least he's paying." And she said, "Cube, he's paying because a judge is watching. That's not the same as changing. And you're going to have to be able to tell the difference for the next 5 years or you'll be right back in that chair." And then she said the harder one. She said, "And if he does change, it'll be slow and it won't look like anything and it won't announce itself." Real change is the most boring thing in the world to watch. If it ever shows up looking dramatic, it's not it. His wife's sister called us the week after the arrest, Tara Lynn. She wanted to know how we could do this to our own son. She said Sean told her we were declining, that we were confused, that they were only trying to help manage things for us. And I said, "Tara Lynn, there's video. There's $118,000 in bank records, and there's an application with my name on it in somebody else's handwriting. Wait for the hearing. It's public." She called me a monster. I said, "No, ma'am, I'm just somebody who quit paying." Now, the hard part. And I'm going to be fair even though I don't feel like it. My son wanted my job. From about 11 to 22, that's what he wanted. He used to sit in that coffee shop off the floor doing his homework and then walk out to the truck with me, asking about bill validators, and that trade closed. Not to him personally, to everybody. 19 technicians down to 6, and they were not hiring again. And there was nothing anybody could do about it. And he ended up selling something on Kitsky that he has never once said a good word about. And then he married a woman with a real problem. And I want to say this carefully because it's my town, in Reno. That's not exotic. That is a thing that happens here to somebody's daughter, somebody's dentist, somebody's shift supervisor, constantly. And most of them are functioning right up until they aren't. And Brack started covering for her. That's how it began. One hole, once. And covering made the hole bigger. And then he was chasing. And he did it in the exact pattern I could have drawn on a napkin. In the town I've lived in for 65 years, in the industry his father worked in for 34. And nobody in that family knew how to name it, including me. And I am the one who should have. That doesn't excuse a thing. He put his hands on me in my own hall and he wrote my name on a document. And there is no bad decade that gets a man there. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you my son is a monster, because he isn't. He's a man who was chasing. And chasing is the most ordinary thing in the world. And it looks completely reasonable from the inside, right up until you're in a courtroom. So here's what this taught me. And it comes right off a casino carpet. Nobody takes anything from you. You hand it over one pull at a time because you keep being shown an almost. That's true of a machine. And it turned out to be true of my family. Every "I'll get it back to you next month" was 2 cherries in a blank. Every small thing he did right, the phone calls, the Christmas, the 2 deposits, was the jackpot symbol sitting just above the pay line where you can see it. And the thing that keeps a hand moving is never the win. It's the almost. So here's the one thing I would ask you to actually do. And it takes about 4 minutes, and it is the opposite of what everybody's instinct says. If somebody in your life owes you money, a kid, a sibling, anybody, go count the paybacks, not the loans. Everybody tracks what they gave, nobody tracks what came back. Write down every partial repayment, the date, the amount, and this is the important part, what happened next. And then look at the shape of it. Because here is what you may find, and it is what we found. If the paybacks are small and irregular and unprompted, and each one is followed within a few months by a larger ask, that is not somebody demonstrating good faith. That is intermittent reinforcement, and it is the exact schedule those machines run on. And it is not an accident that it's working on you. I am not saying the person is doing it on purpose. My son was not sitting there with a chart. Most people who do this are drowning, not scheming. But the mechanism does not care about intent. It works either way. And the only defense against it is a piece of paper with dates on it. Because your feelings will not catch it. Mine didn't. And one more thing. Because this is my town, and I'd be a coward not to say it. If the person in your family is the one at the machine, there is a helpline printed on every cabinet in this state. And there's a national one, 1-800-GAMBLER, and it is free, and it is answered around the clock. It is not a moral failing, and it is treatable. And the average person waits about 7 years to make that call. Don't be average about it. And the question I sit with most nights. When was the last time somebody showed me an almost, and did I write it down as progress? We're all right, Willa and I. The money's ours again. The house is quiet. We do the same thing we've done for about 20 years, which is coffee on the back steps in the evening looking at the pines, and neither of us says much. She's still got the binder. It's in the hall closet with the rest of them, tabbed in order, 3rd from the left. I asked her once if she wanted to throw it out, and she said, "No, that's the year I was right and you finally listened." 45 years. She's gonna